This is the 300mm f2.8 G Master, a lens that I've been waiting 10 years for Sony to make. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and I collect spores, molds, and fungus. All right, for disclosure, Sony lent me this lens to make this review. I don't get to keep it. No money changed hands, and Sony does not get any input on this video's production or get to preview before it's posted. This video does have an actual sponsor, though, and that's Storyblocks. So a fun coincidence that I alluded to in the intro is that almost exactly 10 years ago, when we were still shooting hockey, I was researching a lens like this. And we ultimately went with the Canon 300mm f2.8 because Sony didn't really have anything even remotely like that in their lineup. So it's kind of fun that 10 years later, I can finally look at a Sony version of this lens, even if I don't have a need for it these days. But the first thing that I noticed when picking up this lens, especially when compared to that old Canon, is how much lighter this lens is. It's clocking in at 1,470 grams, which is 3¼ pounds, which is nearly 2 pounds lighter than that Canon lens that we used to use. And actually, even when I handed the lens to Lindsay, shout out to Lindsay, by the way, she's operating the zoom on this video here, her first reaction, and she's not even that familiar with these super telephotos or whatever, was, wow, that's a lot lighter than I expected. It looks heavier than it's gonna be when you put it in your hands. It's surprisingly light. I think they said it's similar to the original 70-200 in terms of weight, so it's surprising. And the way that they accomplish this in part is that the optical formula is different. Rather than they reduce the amount of elements toward the front of the lens and have kind of crammed everything into the rear section here, which not only does it reduce the weight, but it also helps a lot with the balancing because say you're to support the lens here, you feel like you have not only a really good balance on the entire setup, but that all the weight is now in this hand. So you feel really agile with it. And they're definitely, in my brief anyway, they mentioned the capabilities of using this handheld more than being restricted to a monopod. Where again, in that previous setup that I used to use for sports, it was always on a monopod because the whole setup was heavy. But this really does feel like a handheld combo. And we'll talk more about that when I show you some handheld shots and stuff that we did with the stabilization. But let's go over the rest of the build, starting from the front toward the back. So there's a new lens hood design on this one. You've got your push button release here. Comes off really nice and smooth, goes on, feels well made. It's really light, so it doesn't upset that balance thing too much. And you're definitely gonna wanna rock this lens hood most of the time. This front element, not only is it crazy expensive, so you definitely don't wanna damage it, but there's no front filters for this lens. So the only way that you can protect your lens is by using the hood. It does have this thing when it comes to lens caps, which is, more of a fabric cover that is well padded and will protect the lens, especially when you're putting it in storage, but nothing in terms of conventional, quick getting it off and on protection, so definitely rock the hood. Now, if we move further down, you can see that we have 4 focus hold or function buttons all the way around the lens. And then they've got this really cool function ring here, which only turns a little bit in each direction and then stops. But you can set it to 2 different things in the menu. The first one is you can set it to be a constant focus. So you would just sort of toggle it in one direction and it would give you a very steady focus. And then you could toggle the other direction and focus it back. So you could use it for a smooth focus pull if you wanted. Or in the menu, you can change it to be it switches between APS-C and full frame, which is actually pretty rad if you want to quickly, it almost feels like a 1.5 times instant zoom. So you would just go like that, now you're 1.5 times zoomed, go like that, you're back to full frame on a body that supports that, obviously. And then the rest of this is all the focus ring here. And it's okay as far as dampening goes. I feel like it's maybe a little bit sloppy. Maybe it's just because it's so big, it feels lighter than I would expect. But it is completely linear, which is nice. And the focus throw is about maybe, 135 degrees or so. So it's a little bit short, but it's nice that there's a properly linear manual focus on this lens. And there's a switch for full-time DMF below the AF/MF switch that allows you, when enabled, to basically have a constant focus override. So you would autofocus and then you could adjust it slightly if you wanted by turning this. And when it comes to autofocus, it's blazing fast. It has 2 of the XD linear motors, which are that sort of like maglev system. So it's Sony's best and probably the best in the business. It's instant pretty much, and it's completely silent, which is great and handy depending on if you're shooting certain sports or certain wildlife, you're gonna want that. And then there is a switch on the side here for autofocus that toggles between full or 6 meters to infinity. When set to full, it'll go all the way down to 2 meters or 6.5 feet, which is the minimum focus distance. The whole lens is dust and moisture resistant. The collar is built into the lens, so it doesn't come off. Just the foot comes off if you want to remove that. And then because it doesn't take front filters, it has the rear 40.5 millimeter filter holder that you can use on the back of the lens here. And this lens is also compatible with Sony's 1.4 and 2x teleconverters. Okay, I think that's about it as far as the build goes. let's take a look at Lightroom and I'll show you some of the sample images. Okay, so first up here, let's talk about chromatic aberration. I have a shot here where if I zoom in, we can take a look at the areas as they go out of focus in either direction to look for color fringing, longitudinal chromatic aberration. And there definitely is some. I can see fringing in both directions, but similar to when we looked at the RE Signature Prime lens recently, this lens has a better color combination for it. Rather than the bright green and bright magenta, it's more of an amber color when you go this way, and more of a sort of navy blue in this direction, which is much more natural when it sort of fades into the real world. 100% zoom, if you can't really see it, you're probably in pretty good shape. And I took this image as well to just kind of illustrate white background. Can you see anything weird on the screwdriver as we go down? What about on the top of the monitor? Or does it just look kind of black and white? And if so, I think it's a pass. Now, this next one here is to show the minimum focus distance we talked about, the maximum reproduction. The magnification of this lens is 0.16 times, so nothing to write home about. This is what a Rubik's Cube looks like when focused as close as you can focus. Next up, let's talk about bokeh. If we look at this orb here, we can see there's not a lot of junk inside. It looks pretty smooth. The outer membrane is pretty well controlled as well. Don't really have a lot to complain about in terms of the texture. I think they look really nice, really round. We do have some significant sort of cat's eye and cutting in. If we skip ahead to this image, you can see that it can get pretty significant depending on how you're framing up your shot. If we stop down to 5.6, it's pretty much resolved though. And we can see that we have an 11 bladed iris. Next up here, we have some barn boards to look at vignetting and distortion. Distortion is incredibly well controlled, and so is the vignetting. Of course, this will have profiles to make sure that the vignetting and distortion is, controlled in your camera when you put on the profile. So it's not really something I'd really worry about because it'll even be applied to video if that's what you're trying to use it for. Only time it doesn't is if you're adapting. Don't buy this lens to adapt it, that's weird. But yeah, the vignetting and distortion is both great in this shot. And then we have one for sharpness. So when focused here in the center, let's do a crazy, 200% zoom or something. You can see all the little squares of the playing card. Like, it is incredibly sharp. And what's great about it is that you go to any corner and you can, like, the sharpness all the way from the extreme edge to edge is phenomenal on this lens. And it seems to be well centered as well. It's not like one corner seems to be worse than the other, which is nice. And I saw the MTF charts for this lens, and they're like pretty much straight across, and then only dip down to 95% at the edge, which you can't really even see. I mean, maybe this is slightly softer than the center of the lens, but yeah, just really, really nice contrast on the Ace of Spades too. Looks great. Next up, obligatory photos of my kitty cats. Now, this is an example of when the bokeh is exactly what we want. It's just a creamy blur in the background, and we're drawn to the subject. And it doesn't really matter, you're not seeing cat's eyes in the, okay, well, in this case, you are seeing cat's eyes because it's a photo of a cat. But you know what I'm saying? There's no distracting, swirly bokeh. But if we punch into wow, like look how sharp this is. It's crazy sharp. Like, I can see the individual hairs in his eyelashes. Next up, regarding stabilization, I did this test twice. I did a run of photos, and then I got Lindsay to do a run of photos because she has less experience holding a big telephoto lens. So as we got slower and slower shutter speeds, it's not just providing you my data point, I also provided it from somebody who maybe she's a lot smaller. It's harder for her to hold a lens like this. What I found is that for me, the image became unusable around 1/20th of a second, which is really slow for a 300mm lens. This is obviously with stabilization turned on. Now, there are two switches on the lens that control stabilization. One turns the OSS off and on, and the other one is the 1, 2, and 3 modes. Mode 1 is normal, mode 2 is for panning, and mode 3 is for like erratic subjects where you have to, you're moving the lens around a lot. I had it just on 1 on, and that's the mode that I am talking about here in these test images. So yeah, all the way down to 1/20. And I found that that's when the text is starting to get a little bit blurry, as you can see. But by the time I get up to even say 1/60th of a second, it's pretty much perfect. So I feel comfortable hand holding this lens down to 1/50th, 1/60th of a second. Then for Lindsay, I felt like 1/125th was as slow as I would probably go, because when we got down to 1/60th here, I am starting to see a little bit of blur. And then if we go down to 1/30th, this is pretty much unusable. But here's an interesting sort of prover of what I was talking about. I was out doing a photo walk in the woods with this lens, and I was shooting something over here where I was leaning it on a tree stump, and I had it down to 1/25th of a second. And then I was walking this direction, I saw a squirrel, and I quickly tried to take a photo of it without changing my shutter speed. And I didn't realize afterwards that I was still on 1/25th of a second. But while there is some, like, it's not tack sharp, obviously, but this is at 1/25th of a second, no preparation, just turning, focus, shoot. Like, the result is pretty good. If you're not punched in, it looks pretty sharp. So the stabilization is great on this lens. But to give you sort of a live demo of the stabilization turning on and off, because I feel like it's a pretty dramatic effect, I'm just gonna point this at my Storyblocks blanket over there, and you can see how I'm holding the lens. I'm not being supported by anything. I'm holding it like this. I'm choked up a little bit more than I normally would because I wanna be able to switch the OSS on. You can see it's moving quite a bit. And now if I flick the switch on, you can see it pretty much just locks off immediately, and that's great. And since I'm shooting the logo of Storyblocks, it's probably a good time to tell you about them because they are the sponsor of today's video. So Storyblocks is a stock media platform that boasts a massive library of high quality assets aimed to strengthen your video production. Their subscription model provides predictable costs without any pay-per-click pricing. Just pick a plan, pay that fee, and that's it. And you'll enjoy unlimited downloads of HD and 4K video files, images, and motion graphics templates. And the platform is intuitive and easy to use, and new content is added regularly to ensure you have access to updated assets to satisfy your project. And if you're an Adobe Creative Cloud user, you can now access the entire Storyblocks library right in Premiere Pro or After Effects by installing a clever little plugin, which can really speed up your workflow. And whether it's those motion graphics templates or the high quality stock footage, remember that with Storyblocks, anything you download is 100% royalty free forever, with no restrictions on where you can distribute your finished projects. So to get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/undone or click the link in the description. Focus breathing on this lens isn't great. You can see significant changes in your field of view as you focus from MFD to infinity. The lens does support focus breathing compensation on the bodies that have that function, but it still doesn't solve the breathing completely, and it remains quite noticeable. So this is a great example of the creamy bokeh out of focus area, but you can start to see a little bit of that sort of swirl that I'm talking about caused by the cat's eyes. But it still looks great, draws your eye into the subject as intended with this lens. A couple more shots. Really, really sharp. Looks great. Punch in here. Yeah, no issues. You can see all of his little eyebrows and everything. It's super sharp. Looks great across the frame. But if we jump ahead to these shots that were in the woods with trees and leaves and everything around, now you can start to see how maybe the bokeh could be a little bit distracting. It's not a big deal, but it depends on the subject and what you're shooting. You see how it kind of has a directionality to it, almost like it's creating this sort of like swirly arch. I would say it's even more significant in this shot. Now, it still does well to isolate and you still draw your eye on them, but there is a bit more of this kind of like, you know, warpy, trippy kind of thing going on, which became more prevalent whenever there was a lot of stuff in the scene. And I took this photo just purely to illustrate this example of this. You see how it just looks like there's almost, like I said, like a direction to it, like it's swooping around in the background. This photo annoys me, by the way. I took it specifically to showcase this aspect, but then when I was looking at it in post, like I focused here, and then I realized afterwards, like, why didn't I focus on this leaf? It would have been such a better image if I'd focused on this leaf instead of just this hunk of wood here. You guys ever do that? You look at a photo afterwards, you're like, oh, that was such a better focus point. Why did I focus over here? I'm an idiot. Okay, what else do we got here? Flare, I actually find it to be a little bit of a problem, but only in certain situations. I recommend you have the hood on all the time, which is gonna minimize the angles that flare is even gonna be an issue. It is a G master, which means it has the coatings and stuff like that, but I do find the flare, despite that, to be aggressive on this lens. Again, it only shows up in certain angles, but if you do manage to get it, whew, as you can see here, it put a crazy blue just all over the entire frame to where you can't even really see what's going on in it. Like, I don't know why you'd be shooting your siding like this, but if you were and the sun was here, it just obliterates the frame, as you can see. So you're gonna want to avoid, don't buy this lens for shooting into the sun, basically, is what I'm trying to say. Can you see this like massive sort of blue, just no contrast circle going on here? Yeah, I mean, this kind of looks a little bit pretty actually, but don't point at the sun with this lens. It's nothing but bad results. Here's something I was really impressed by. There are no edits to this image whatsoever, but look at how punchy these colors are, how great the contrast is. Look at the edge of this leaf, just like how clean that edge is and how like creamy the background is and how sharp. You know, you're not seeing chromatic aberration or any kind of issues at all in a practical shot like this, even when I'm 160% zoomed in. Now, I don't fancy myself much of a bird photographer, but I figured it was required to take at least one photo of a bird while using a lens like this. So I found this tiny little, I think this is a woodpecker. This is what he looks like. Again, really sharp, really nice. Got another strange type of bird that I took a photo of here. Again, really sharp, nice contrast, just really pops, looks great. And then one more picture of a squirrel, which again, I thought turned out great. Really, really sharp, great detail. Super impressed by this. Like the transition from it to the background, really clean, really nice edge. And these were all shot with the A1, by the way. That's usually what I use for these lens tests. Lastly, I just have 2 images that I think show a couple of the little weaknesses with this lens, use cases where, you know, you might not be pleased with the results. This one is about specular highlights, these tiny little white circles here. If we punch right in on them, they actually do have quite a bit of obvious chromatic aberration on them. But again, we're punched in significantly here in order for you to see that at a distance like this. I mean, who's using a 300mm lens to take this shot anyway? But I just wanted to show you that little speculars, if they happen to be in your scenes a lot, do have noticeable fringing on them. And then the other one is if you like to do stuff like this, where you create your little abstract worlds by close focusing, struggle with little aberrations that kind of make them look softer and glisteny. I would call this image a pass. Like I wouldn't complain that much about this little character here, but I would say that mixed with the little soap bubbly kind of bokeh in the foreground, it's a bit busy and it's a little bit soft. So maybe this isn't your best use case for a lens like this. Obviously, I mean, you know, why would you buy a 300mm 2.8 and then shoot stuff like this? Just use a 35. But anyway, those are the only 2 instances where I thought, kind of weaker performance for the price category. But again, where this lens really shines and what it's best used for is isolating a subject and getting an incredibly sharp image of that subject. It really is a terrific lens. You know, it excels at what it's supposed to do. And I think that if you're getting it for that purpose, you're going to be really pleased with the results. But I'm curious, audience, are you looking for a 300mm lens? Because like I said, for me, it's been 10 years since I was shopping for one. So I'm not really sure what the demand is like for a Sony shooter for a lens like this. You know, I've just kind of gotten used to the fact that there is no 300mm for Sony and have made do with other focal lengths. Are you in the same boat, or are you really excited about a lens like this? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to know what you think. And thanks for watching the video. Hope it was helpful for you. And yada, yada, yada. All right, I'm done.